NTV Television Network presents. The Other Day, Current Era, 1992. Translation and voiceover by BMI Russian. Good evening and welcome to episode 32 of our series, The Other Day, Current Era. The episodes covering years 61 through 91 were about history that can still be considered modern, while these are going to be about modern times that have become history. Things you can't imagine us without, let alone understand. Let's talk 1992. Disputes over the Crimea, Santa Barbara, Gaidar's shock therapy, Clamshell Garages, Mike Tyson in prison, Nana, the introduction of Pampers, Vouchers, Chernomyrdin and Luzhkov in top positions, Czechoslovakia's breakup. In 1992, viewers from all around the country began tuning into the first never-ending soap opera, which was the US-produced Santa Barbara. The viewers were living alongside the characters in real time, day after day, year after year. The show was set in a town called Santa Barbara in California. The head of the family, a businessman named C.C. Capwell, whose son Mason was adored by the female viewers. Somebody was always dating, breaking up, getting married, divorced. What's going on with you two? Are you quarreling again? Oh, no. We've never been happier. Is that right, dear? It's cold as ice in here. Mass audiences found this to be a realistic series, with millions of Russians being able to relate to the problems of these American millionaires. Ironically, one of the next series to air would be called The Rich Also Cry. Conservative viewers were outraged, while advocates of the vulgar genre stood in defense, claiming that such soap operas stimulate economic activity. I stay out of your affairs, you stay out of mine. Now you listen to me. You seem to forget whose money is paying for the movie. On January 2nd, the first workday after New Year, fixed prices were liquidated. This was the beginning of shock therapy. Radical economic reforms were pretty much announced like in a game of hide-and-seek, like Ready or Not, Here I Come. And still, millions of people were totally unprepared for them. Officially, the cabinet was run by the president. On the political front, the popular Boris Yeltsin was covering for an unprecedentedly young team led by 35-year-old Yegor Gaidar. Some goods became 3, some 30, others 300 times more expensive. Military spending was reduced dramatically, enterprises were denied state funding, social expenses amounted to close to zero. Those in opposition to the cabinet labeled these reforms as shock without therapy. Those who sympathized claimed that they should have started with privatization instead of liberating prices. Various estimates placed anywhere from half to 90% of the population below the subsistence minimum. In their own defense, Gaidar and his team, the so-called capitalist ministers, made note that there were plenty of goods, lines had all but disappeared, and the ruble became an actual currency. January 29th was the day when Soviet commerce was killed by President Yeltsin's Order No. 65 on free trade. Enterprises and private parties were allowed to engage in trade, particularly for cash, without having to receive a special permit, and in all areas that were convenient for the purpose. The following day, the entire country poured out onto the streets to either buy or sell. This had to be the single most widely supported decision made by the government. The Russian market was emerging on railway station squares, in underground crossings, and at bus stops. Ever since the 1992 winter season, there hasn't been a winter quite as snowy. Right here where Okhotny Ryad Street flows into Lubyanka is where the largest bazaar in the country was located. This was more than just open trade. This is where the people lost their fear of the main authoritative figures of the previous era, KGB agents from the headquarters building on my left, and foreigners who'd stay in the Metropole Hotel on my right. They'd sell everything from kids' tights, white bread in plastic baggies, and women's boots to homemade sauerkraut in glass jars. People were also learning the art of haggling. When asked how much, sellers would give a brilliant answer. The asking price is 100, which usually meant he'd easily go down to 20. For those who couldn't afford new clothes of even Turkish origin, there were thousands of tons of second-hand apparel being imported. This was a dignified label for what were essentially old used clothes, and it stuck immediately. They were running commercials on TV advertising the best European second-hand wholesale by weight. In 1992, the first ever Booker Prize was awarded for Best Russian Novel of the Year. The Lenin Prize was no more, nobody had any idea how to bestow state prizes, and so the Booker Prize was now Russia's main literary award. The first person to receive one was Mark Karatanov, for his book Lines of Fate or Milosevic's Chest. The English Booker McConnell Group specialized in chicken and had long been awarding prizes to the best novels to come out of Britain. When entering the Russian bird meat market, the company put together a panel, published a large list of contenders, followed by a short list of finalists. That's when Russian intellectuals started using the English term shortlist. The winner was announced at the restaurant in the House of Architects. The prize winner received an envelope with the equivalent of 10,000 British pounds in rubles at the exchange rate of the day. There was so much commotion on account of the Britons who decided to look into the world of Russian literature that among the many domestic awards that followed, there was even an anti-Booker Prize. Today, the last fruit fly perished. The communists, who now found themselves in the opposition, began to mobilize their constituency and to organize meetings and protests. Red flags were waving once again. The communists filed a lawsuit in the Constitutional Court intending to overrule Yeltsin's orders on banning the CPSU and seizing the party's property. Nationalists, internationalists, communists, and monarchists were all united in protest, despite seeming so uncompromising in the past. Red banners with hammers and sickles were waving next to imperial black, yellow, and white flags, portraits of Stalin and Lenin standing next to Nicholas II. The opposition's protests rotated between Moscow's main squares, and in the summer, an indefinite picket began next to the Ostankino TV center. A couple of officers of the law having their skulls broken served as a pass for protesters to access the TV center, but the beating was unnecessary, as the protest leaders weren't given a live broadcast, and the programming schedule remained unchanged. Proceedings at the Constitutional Court were nothing like the Nuremberg Tribunal. The lawsuit on the CPSU being unconstitutional wasn't even subject to examination. After 6 months of deliberation, the court ruled that party organizations have to come first, as in they cannot be dissolved, their property cannot be seized. The president's orders were partially overruled. The earliest stage of civilized free trade involved kiosks that were 10 by 13 feet with a height of 6.5, of the type where they'd used to sell draft beer and kvass, and that were considered too tight for newspapers and magazines. Now they contained all sorts of popular imported consumer goods. For liberalized, or in other words, unusually steep prices, without any receipts or warranties, albeit round the clock in many cases, they'd sell imported cigarettes, disposable lighters, razors, pens, AA batteries, tampons, condoms, Italian pasta and German sausage in airtight packaging, canned food, chocolate, Kinder Surprises, juices, Napoleon cognac, and amaretto liquor. These kiosks were a symbol of the economic reforms that ushered in small-time business based around said kiosks. Future sharks of Russian industry would all have resumes that started with work at a kiosk. 1992 was an Olympic game year. The Soviet Union was gone, but the former Union republics hadn't had time to assemble separate national teams, and so a united CIS team was sent to the Summer and Winter Games of that year. CIS stands for Commonwealth of Independent States. At the Winter Games in Albertville, France, out of 139 CIS athletes, 118 represented Russia. Officially, they were all competing under the Olympic flag, with the Olympic hymn played upon victory. The Baltic states entered their own teams for the first time ever. The CIS team was second after Germany in the unofficial rankings, with the highlights being the hockey team's victory and the stunning performance put on by cross-country skier Lyubov Yegorova. At the Summer Games in Barcelona, together with the Olympic banner, they also carried out the individual flags of all 12 CIS member states, with their respective anthems playing. The Americans were undoubtedly the stars of those games. They easily made it to first place, with their basketball team being comprised of NBA players. It is tough to go against Jordan. I mean, he is considered the best defensive player. He is hard to outperform. In 1992, car theft skyrocketed, with a total of 123,000 stolen. This prompted Russian city dwellers to buy a massive amount of clamshell garages for storage, which was apparently the best solution. For example, in Moscow, anywhere from 50 to 100 cars parked on the street were being stolen daily, while for garage-kept cars that number was 1 per year. Locals were always calling to ban these disgusting-looking metal boxes that were ruining the city's appearance, and authorities were also displeased, as they had more interest in collaborating with garage construction cooperatives. However, garage owners were usually able to come to terms with either side. Dacha owners used clamshells for storing mini-tractors, they were good for keeping a boat, or for setting up a shop on the side of the road. The Crimea is where Sevastopol is located, home to the Black Sea Navy fleet. For the whole of 1992, they were arguing who that belongs to, both in the Ukraine, where they used just Ukraine, and in Russia. Kiev's parliament demanded that army and navy divisions stationed in Ukraine take a new oath, and the Black Sea Fleet was declared Ukrainian property. All of Moscow's political forces objected, especially since the initial agreement was to place the former Soviet Navy under the Commonwealth's command. Prior to 1954, the Crimea was in fact a part of the Russian Federation, but Khrushchev signed it off to Ukraine because at the time it made sense. That order was never properly formalized to comply with even Soviet legislature. The Navy issue really set Russia's parliament into motion, sparking discussion about the peninsula's status. Russia's Black Sea Fleet was, is, and will carry on. The legendary Sevastopol, where enemies won't be allowed. Oh, Sevastopol, Sevastopol, making Russian sailors proud. In 1992, the arguing sides would keep on appealing to our Navy's former glory, to old songs, to the history books. The shadows of our great ancestors called upon to bear witness. Yes, the Crimea was made from RSFSR into Ukrainian territory on a whim. And yes, Sevastopol never became a Ukrainian town after the transfer, staying under Union jurisdiction, under Moscow's direct control, bypassing Simferopol and Kiev. Yeltsin insisted that under no circumstances would the fleet go to Ukraine, sailors refused to pledge allegiance to Ukraine, and the Crimea's Supreme Soviet declared the territory's sovereignty. However, nobody seemed to be willing to take a firm stand. They decided to stick to the status quo, maintaining Soviet borders and allowing Ukraine to control Sevastopol. The Crimean Supreme Soviet's daring decision was withdrawn, and the fleet was divided, with the Ukrainian portion taking their due oath. But neither side had the capacity or the funds to properly maintain the ships they so passionately fought over. One weak side took from another and had no idea what to do with the spoils. Prior to 1992, nobody was aware of such a thing as remittance advice, or how it could be fraudulent. In 1992, about $6 billion were stolen from Russia's central bank based on forged remittance advice. This had to be the largest-scale bank heist in all of history. All you had to do was find and fill out an empty form of the right standard for financial documents to guarantee further transfer of funds. For the central bank, the actual amount would be indicated, issuable in cash. The perpetrators had to have had their people on the other side, given that they were withdrawing gigantic sums in a time when cash was in short supply. The very first audit revealed 386 fake advice notes from Chechnya. Authoritative Chechens were hesitant at first to take credit as the scheme's creators, but later they were even proud to announce that the funding partially went towards purchasing weapons for the army as opposed to lining someone's pockets. Most criminal cases remained unsolved as the perpetrators were never found. Following a UN Safety Council resolution, an international coalition was being put together to uphold peace in Yugoslavia. It included Russian military units, among others. This was the first time our soldiers donned blue UN spec helmets. In March of 1992, in Ryazan, an inspection was underway of paratroopers selected from divisions out of Pskov and Tula. The battalions we sent to Yugoslavia received the names Rusbat 1 and Rusbat 2. On this day, we are dispatching a peacekeeping contingent from Russia to the former Yugoslavia, on orders from the Russian government and the president himself. 1,500 Russian soldiers were sent to eastern Slavonia and Sarajevo. Serving under the UN was quite lucrative, with privates receiving $1.28 daily, which was unbelievable money at the time. And officers had it even better. The locals usually took warmly to our boys, with them being just as distrustful and suspicious of peacekeepers sent over from the US. In the eyes of the simple and rugged Slavs, the Yanks, with their mobile showers and chemical toilets, appeared to be soft and timid. This was actually a favorite theme for Russian journalists who made trips to Yugoslavia, namely how the truth of the trenches was superior to American comfort. For the first time in history, a country's vice president was openly confronting the president while maintaining his position. Alexander Rutskoy was trying to become an independent player in politics. 1 year before, in '91, when the well-spoken colonel, hero, and CPSU reformer was invited to become a vice presidential candidate, he was seen as a decorative figure, to attract voters from military and communist circles who couldn't stomach Yeltsin. But then the former pilot realized that he had more in him than that. Rutskoy promptly lost the power struggle, unable to secure any sort of authority. The crucial economic reforms were happening without any input on his behalf, forcing him to become a public politician. He toured Russia and neighboring countries and shocked the public with statements such as, "The president is issuing orders that aren't being carried out," or "The president can't even manage his own assistants." Rutskoy called out Tatar nationalists, attempted to instate martial law in Chechnya, promised to prevent Ukraine from acquiring the Crimea, and labeled the young cabinet boys in pink trousers. As for the pink trousers, well, that was just a comparative synonym. He had a decisive demeanor, expensive suits, and a lush mustache. The vice president was a favorite among women. For a while, Rutskoy was the most captivating figure in Russian politics. But at some point, Yeltsin unexpectedly and quite treacherously tasked him with developing the agricultural sector, which historically was a job to bring down any senior official. The military pilot was upset at first, but soon after passionately took to contemplating land reforms, apparently seeing himself as the new Stolypin. While the hunters were loading their rifles, in 1992, all of a sudden, the people learned that telephones were incredibly versatile. Wealthy folks would acquire answering machines from renowned brands, while those who earned less bought domestic devices that displayed caller ID. Those who had answering machines formally requested to leave a message after the long beep. Some callers liked to have fun and introduce themselves as questioning machines. And some of the owners of these gadgets wouldn't even pick up the phone until they heard the voice of whoever was calling. Caller ID displays would show and store the caller's phone number. 539-6333. A cordless phone allowed you to walk between rooms while holding the handset. All of these new devices were push-button, with rotary dial phones completely disappearing from stores. A new age gave birth to new heroes. Thousands upon thousands of companies were now forced to submit yearly and quarterly reports, but financial experts were few and far between. A financial expert was any given entrepreneur's personal risk, an individual feat, while true mass heroism was displayed by groves of accountants, with this now becoming the trendiest of all trades. For the first time ever, songs were even written about accountants. In the past, your typical accountant would have been a low-value and perpetually single woman, but now newspapers were overflowing with job postings. Working for a private firm, one could earn 5 times more than for doing the same thing but in a state-owned company. So accountants were performing their usual duties for unusually high paychecks. It was the calling of the times, just like in the song, "I won't shy away from your commands, Comrade Time." Honestly, what was there to be afraid of? Soviet firms and their invoices were superseded by Russian offices equipped with computers. No more wobbling desks, no more old closets that were placed like this to divide a big room into smaller segments. Desks were now made of plastic, and they were resistant to ball pens and cigarettes. Office chairs were a separate story altogether. First of all, they had to swivel. Second, they had to have wheels. Desks no longer had panes of glass placed on top of them to cover train timetables, kids' pictures, phone numbers, calendars, and other nonsense. Office equipment of all sorts was brought in from all around the world. For whatever reason, posters disappeared, the type that depicted Nikita Mikhalkov, Mikhail Boyarsky, or Grey Kitties. Instead, you now had office humor. Sheets of paper that would be sent around via fax or made using a computer. Rules of conduct, for example, to the effect of: Rule number 1, the boss is always right. Rule number 2, if not, see rule number 1, and so on. In 1992, you literally couldn't get away from talks about the heir to the Russian throne. In April, Grand Duke Vladimir Kirillovich passed away in France. He was the great-nephew of Nicholas II. According to his will, he was to be buried in the Peter and Paul Cathedral. Ties with St. Petersburg Mayor Sobchak allowed his relatives to fulfill his wish. Members of this branch of the Romanov family tree, who were usually called the Kirilloviches, came to Russia for the first time ever. Grand Duchess Leonida Georgievna, who was born Bagration of Mukrani, her daughter Maria Vladimirovna, and her grandson George Hohenzollern, the proclaimed heir to the throne, began to frequently pay visit to their historic homeland. They were adored by the media and would receive a warm welcome from national and local government. Monarchism was pretty popular, and the royal family's travels around the country were presented with an almost pre-revolutionary grandeur, as if the masters of the Russian land were meeting with their friendly subjects. The idea was to send George to the Russian military academy, sort of in preparation for his mission of ruling as the monarch. The Kirilloviches were at odds with other members of the family, who didn't recognize the chubby George as head of the house, though Russian media had yet to touch on the matter. The sexual revolution was followed by a revolution associated with maternity and childhood. When a child was born, families would have to constantly deal with washing cloth diapers, for which they'd even buy a small dedicated washing machine. But all of that became a thing of the past as soon as Pampers came along. Now newborn Russians also enjoyed having dry bottoms. The beginning of widespread use of Pampers diapers in Russia coincided with a decline in the birth rate. And so only a lucky few parents were able to experience firsthand that Pampers protected against all sorts of accidents. But the majority learned from the TV commercial that a child won't catch a cold when walking around or wake up from sleeping. After wearing the new Pampers Plus, you can see that the skin is dry to the touch and healthy. I am so gleeful to see him this happy. Disposable diapers were such a convenient thing that even with certain medical experts expressing their concern on the harm of constantly wearing absorbent underpants, their reputation remained unaffected. Women's lives became slightly more bearable, with imported tampons hitting the market at about the same time as Pampers, as well as pads with flaps and without. TV commercials featuring these hygiene products opened men's eyes to the most intimate problems experienced by the opposite sex, while teaching women the subtle expression women's period. OB tampons for reliable internal absorption. They provide me comfort and confidence on any day of the week. My secret is simply OB. In 1992, the first ever security/investigation license was issued in Moscow. Bodyguards, or security guards, depending on how you want to call them, were a crucial component of that era. They would either stand in groups next to any somewhat significant entrances and exits, in that case they were security service, or they'd accompany any somewhat important person who was moving around, in which case they were bodyguards. Power structure personnel would prefer to work with one of the many private agencies offering their services at the time. They would guard offices, escort cargo, with protecting the big boss being the peak of such a career. A top-tier businessman or politician couldn't go anywhere without being followed by a couple of well-built guys with blank faces. A common formation was 4 men on the perimeter and 1 personal bodyguard following half a step behind. He would be called the assigned bodyguard in keeping with the old traditions of the Politburo. The typical bodyguard was usually a guy named Volodya, a former Marine or paratrooper who'd wear a cheap double-breasted suit and bright white socks. He was a man's new best friend, always sticking close, never talking, and who understood without you having to say a thing. On March 7, 1992, a large crowd gathered at the Tbilisi airport to meet the former Republican Central Committee First Secretary, Politburo member, and USSR Foreign Affairs Minister Eduard Shevardnadze, who had returned to Georgia. He was met at the airfield by the 2 most powerful men in the country, Tengiz Kitovani and Jaba Yoseliani. Exactly 2 months had gone by since Georgia's first president Zviad Gamsakhurdia fled the country. In Mingrelia, a province that remained loyal to him, a civil war was on the horizon. Also, Abkhazia and South Ossetia were looking to split away. Shevardnadze claimed that he had no other choice but to return. 3 days later, he was already chairman of the state council. Kitovani and Yoseliani, who had previously overthrown Gamsakhurdia, were referred to as heroes by Shevardnadze, though he would strip them of their power as soon as he made it to the top.
We truly have every opportunity at this stage, in this critical moment, in this transitional period in the development of the Republic, of the state, to establish a new society.
However, the leaders of 2 superpowers agreed on the need for more active dialogue. In 1992, a law was passed to straighten out the situation on the stock market. By that time, there were over 700 trade platforms in the former Soviet Union, which was more than in the rest of the entire world. The old state supply structures could not keep up with these trading platforms, where you could buy or sell absolutely anything. In some institute lecture hall, you had on offer everything from computers, perfume and coal, to used cars, cotton and stockings. Moscow's commodity exchange worked with up to 2,000 products. Broker firms set the Russian profit margin standard at no less than 100%. For the professional speculators who were brokers, life was a game based around exchange rates. According to newspapers, 1 single transaction could earn them the average 5-year Russian salary, which was $800 in 1992. On July 4, 1992, the papers printed a public letter from Gavril Popov, who decided to step down as the mayor of Moscow. Yeltsin accepted his resignation and assigned the position of Moscow's city manager to Yuri Luzhkov. Luzhkov ran together with Popov in the election and used to be the head of Moscow's town administration. Instead of a politician, Moscow was now run by a business manager. Popov had complained that he had no support from the president or the government. Luzhkov assured that he and his predecessor were politically like-minded, but his main concern were problems that needed to be solved. Moscow province was sabotaging milk supply, construction of the Poklonnaya Hill Memorial Complex was being delayed, and these were the first two issues he set out to resolve. In 1992, many felt that the Russian Federation could collapse in the same way as the Soviet Union. On top of the rebellious Chechnya, two of the most densely populated republics were now demanding independence. Tataria, now meant to be called Tatarstan, and Bashkiria, with its new and rather difficult to pronounce name Bashkortostan. There were serious discussions going on about breaking away from Russia. The presidents of the autonomies, former First Secretary of Tataria's Regional Committee Shaimiev and former oil refinery director Rakhimov, made it clear that they were merely fulfilling the will of their peoples. They even held a vote on sovereignty in Tataria, with the majority being in favor, though the Russian Constitutional Court avoided the results. Shaimiev was able to secure recognition of Republican assets, and so he no longer needed power-hungry allies. In October, the militia brutally suppressed a nationalist rally, and Tataria once again became a subject of the Russian Federation. With their neighbors setting the example, Bashkiria made do with a 30% stake in its crude oil production. In 1992, the Iron Curtain that separated us from the rest of the world was superseded by metal export. Precious metals were being stolen from the country's metallurgic, civil engineering and military factories and sold abroad. And on top of lucrative export, you had equally profitable re-export. For example, Latvia, where there was no production of precious metal, exported a good 238,000 tons worth of them in 1992, while Estonia was supplying record amounts of nickel. Legal export was too taxing, with all of the licenses, customs fees, insurance premiums, and so on. While the borders were still transparent, you could simply ship metal to the west via the Baltic states and reap the rewards, even when selling at bargain basement prices. No amount was too small. Mid-level businessmen acquired scrap from the general public, while factory workers were stealing copper wire. Massive supply toppled aluminum trade, with global prices dropping almost twofold. In Europe, stolen titanium from Russia was 6 times cheaper than Japanese titanium. In 1992, world heavyweight boxing champion, the mighty and menacing Mike Tyson was sentenced to prison. In July of 1991, Tyson attended the Miss Black America beauty pageant, where he met with one of the contestants, 18-year-old Desiree Washington, who voluntarily visited Tyson in his hotel room at 2 a.m., and one day later filed a sexual assault report. The judge who was presiding over that trial was a well-known feminist who her entire life worked as a sex crime prosecutor, and who had only ever lost one case. Plus, the jury was all white. Tyson was sentenced to 6 years in a solitary prison cell. While in jail, the champ trained and worked. After making millions of dollars boxing, now he was sweeping rooms for 60 cents an hour. 3 years later, Mike was released for good behavior. He came out of prison a devoted Muslim who went by the name of Malik Abdulaziz. He had 2 tattoos on his shoulders with Martin Luther King and Mao Zedong. Starting on October 1st, 1992, Russian citizens began to receive privatization checks worth 10,000 rubles. That was defined as one's individual stake in the nation's wealth. National assets were falling into private hands. And then, instead of the cumbersome term privatization check, the even more obscure voucher was introduced, though soon people got used to the word. Simultaneously, the country learned the name of privatizer number 1. He was State Property Committee Chairman Anatoly Chubais. The main newspaper headline in the fall of 1992 read, "The twin brothers Chubais and Voucher." Traders on the street were standing with signs saying "Will buy and sell vouchers." Some people were willing to trade their portion of the national wealth for a bottle of vodka. Some brought their vouchers to investment funds from the TV commercials that would have names with words such as gold, oil, and diamond, a clear indication that they'd bring in profit. The patient ones made it to the first check auctions. Apparently, those who successfully invested their vouchers never told, and overall, the people didn't really get that much out of the privatization. In 1992, the government relinquished its exclusive rights to manufacture hard liquor, which in Russia was pretty much entirely vodka, and all while liberalizing alcohol prices. Now any company was allowed to produce vodka and spirit. However, it made 0 sense to manufacture it legally, with duties being as high as 80%. The market was flooded with cheap imitations made in basements. Industrial alcohol with burnt sugar coloring in beer bottles was sold as cognac, while spirit mixed with water passed for vodka. The latter recipe was also used by people at home. As for the hottest selling item of the year, that would be royal spirit, which was of ambiguous origin, though it would say Holland on some bottles. A single 1-liter bottle of 192 proof Royal could be watered down into 5 half-liter bottles of surrogate vodka. As for the hottest new product from a supposedly reputable company, that was Rasputin vodka, which was even featured in TV commercials. The bearded Gregory would come to life and tell you in a thick accent that genuine bottles depicted him in 2 spots.
At first I look at you like this, but if you were to flip this over, I give you a wink.
After the collapse of the Soviet Empire, the conflicts happening on the outskirts had grown into full-blown wars. The places with the most bloodshed were Tajikistan, Abkhazia, and Transnistria. The Supreme Soviet in Abkhazia reinstated the Constitution of 1925, when the republic was not a part of Georgia. The Georgians then occupied Sukhumi. The Abkhazian government relocated to Gudauta, where they announced general mobilization to go on a patriotic war in the name of liberating the motherland. With Russia officially maintaining neutrality but indirectly assisting, the Abkhazians stormed Sukhumi, forcing the Georgian population of Abkhazia to flee with the army. Murders and looting were instigated by both sides. The all-union health resorts Pitsunda and Gagri would never see another tourist again. The civil war in Tajikistan involved the Uzbekistani Air Force and rival Mujahideen forces from Afghanistan, ethnic Tajiks and Uzbeks. The poorest of the former Soviet republics bore witness to medieval savagery. The Russians living in Tajikistan scrambled to leave the country. As for the Tajiks, around 150,000 of them moved to Afghanistan. Even there, the situation wasn't as hectic. The only entity in Dushanbe with any real power was the drug mafia, with the republic being a transit hub for drugs en route from Middle Asia to Europe. Meanwhile, in Moldavia, 750,000 Russians established the unrecognized Republic of Transnistria and declared their independence from Chisinau. Summer of 1992 is when military operations began. After the Moldavians attempted a takeover of Bender, the front lines were joined by units of Russia's 14th Army that was stationed nearby. The army's commander, General Lebed, promised in his booming voice to utilize his division's artillery, after which the fighting quickly died down. In 1992, a series of explosions sweeps through the Primorskii Krai. In March, there was a fire at the Far East Military District's ammunition storage facility near Korol. In May, a spectacular series of blasts near Vladivostok, at the Pacific Fleet's ammunition warehouse. Missiles, bombs, and torpedoes were going off. The arsenal was located next to housing units, a hospital, and defense factory buildings. 300,000 residents were within the potential blast radius. The people were urgently evacuated. BTRs and helicopters were sent to put the fire out. However, the facilities remained unapproachable until they completely burned to the ground on day 2. The military alleged foul play, while newspapers were hinting at a possible cover-up of possible theft. Central Committee member, Foreign Affairs Minister Raoul Leroy, and other officials. In 1992, the resurgence of the Cossacks was formalized. The men who were happy to pose in front of TV cameras in tunics, Circassian coats, papakas, and peaked caps were declared a, quote, cultural ethnic community of historic origin.
The state is in need of secure borders, stout armed forces, and the Cossacks
or meeting the government halfway, with it being in line with their own needs and desires. The laws being passed and the president's orders stipulated that land plots next to old farmsteads and villages were to be provided to Cossack communities free of charge. They also reinstated local autonomous governance in traditional Cossack settlements. The Cossacks felt like they were in charge in the Don and Kuban regions. In Kurgansk they were arresting heads of districts, in Rostov they seized the former House of Political Education, while giving the local paper's editor-in-chief a whipping in public for being unpatriotic. In 1992, Czechoslovakia was divided into Czechia and Slovakia. This had the entire world in awe, with the home of the Velvet Revolution showing an example of civilized separation. Apparently, the only thing Russia took notice of was that our main competitor in hockey tournaments was no longer the Czechoslovakian, but instead the Czech national team. The Western Czech Republic, with its thriving industry, was always more affluent than the Eastern agrarian Slovakia. The Czech capital Prague also used to be the capital of the Czechoslovakian Federation, while the Slovakian capital Bratislava was always relegated to being a provincial center. As soon as the Slovaks' desire for national self-identification outweighed the lack of benefit from such a move, Czechoslovakian President Havel became the Czech president. 16 agreements were attached to the separation, and on the final day of 1992, the two nations split apart. Gaidar has done enough, Gaidar can leave now. This phrase was quite popular in late 1992. The acting prime minister was finally sent into retirement in December by the 7th People's Deputy Congress. He was replaced by the recently appointed deputy prime minister Viktor Chernomyrdin, who was the former head of Gazprom and before that the USSR Minister of Gas Industry. The young economics professor and Moscow liberal protege who spoke fluent English and Spanish was replaced by a man old enough to be his father, a seasoned economic manager from Orenburg who could barely articulate his thoughts in Russian.
I wouldn't want to present me as being... We've already seen it before, right? A kamikaze cabinet, but no way. We are a proper Russian administration, looking to do decent job, without turning into who we're not.
These changes gave people hope. Finally, we had a head of government who actually looked the part. Chernomyrdin disrespectfully referred to the previous administration as lab superintendents. He claimed to be for a civilized market and promised to replenish circulating assets. Some of the young reformists kept their seats, though. Plus, it would soon become apparent that Chernomyrdin himself wasn't much of a red manager. He fell in love with capitalism back in the days when he was still supervising the lucrative gas sector, perhaps in a different way than Gaidar, but he was no less infatuated. Pop music was one of the only market segments left where domestic products were at the forefront. Barry Alibasov, the first public producer in Russian show business, presented a long-pending project of his, a boy band called Nana. Alibasov explained that he would go around singing na 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 to himself when he was in a good mood, and that's where the name came from. The Fresh collective didn't necessarily have a frontman, and its members all had very similar voices, but there was a face to satisfy anyone's taste. The fans called them the Nanais, while haters preferred When Anchors. With that, we've covered 1992 in our series The Other Day Current Era. Episode 33 will be about 1993, Herbalife, the Yes, Yes, No, Yes vote, Rutskoy's 11 suitcases, the Davos World Economic Forum, the attack on Moscow's White House, tennis, the sport of kings, the conception of TV6 and NTV, Snickers and Bounty bars, Michael Jackson's first visit to Moscow. See you for a new episode and a new year. Farewell.